Now, in the spotlight today, video of an unarmed black man in Brazil being asphyxiated with gas in the trunk of a police car after getting stopped by highway patrol has sparked fury in the country. Images of the police stop on Tuesday in Umbaúba in the northeastern state of Sergipe show the officers pinning Genivaldo de Jesus Santos down on the ground before forcibly keeping him in the back of their police vehicle as a dense cloud of white smoke emerges from the SUV. The 38-year-old handcuffed man, described by his family as suffering from schizophrenia, can be heard screaming, and his legs, which stick out of the vehicle, kick for a time until they eventually stop moving. The officers seem undisturbed by onlookers surrounding them. Many observers have noted similarities to the case of George Floyd, whose death at the hands of a police officer in Minnesota 2 years ago sparked massive protests and also some riots across the United States. So let's bring on our spotlight guest for today, Omékongo Dibinga, professor of intercultural communication at American University. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So some people are calling this the Brazilian George Floyd case. Do you agree with that comparison?
Well, I think that I understand the comparison, but I think on some levels, when you look at what's going on in Brazil, it's actually worse, where, I believe it was 2020 or 2021, over 6,000 people who were killed by police, 80% of those being black men. You have a president in place like Bolsonaro, who many people call the Trump of Brazil. But quite honestly, he as former military, he has more control over the military and the police forces. So on many levels, Brazil is living in a larger and a more dangerous police state than in the United States. And then you add the situations relating to mental health, and we have our own issues relating to that in the United States. I'm going to assume that in Brazil, the capacity of law enforcement to be able to deal with people with mental health issues is even less advanced than it is in the United States.
So would you say that black people in Brazil are treated even worse than in the United States, according to what you're saying?
Well, I mean, we're seeing why the Black Lives Matter movement was such an international movement. And so I am saying on many levels, you can make the case that people who are black in Brazil are being treated in a worse situation than black people in America. You know, our situation in the United States is definitely dire. We have our challenges. But when you look at areas relating to leadership, you know, there's more black representation in terms of leadership and in corporate spaces and other places. We definitely don't have the police and military being such an occupying force. You see what's happening in the favelas in Brazil, especially where people are where a lot of these killings are happening. We have that concentrated poverty, because rather than fight a war against poverty, they'd rather fight a war against the poor, so who happen to be located in many of these areas and are black. So yes, I feel like you can make an argument that on many levels it's worse for black people in Brazil than in the United States, and they're in the majority. Brazil has the highest concentration of black people of any country in the world outside of Nigeria.
Do you think we should always, though, be sort of extrapolating out of such incidents, these grander narratives? There are an incident, when it's captured on video like that in such a graphic way, and it makes the rounds on Twitter, then people will be outraged, but sometimes it doesn't always tell the full story. Do you think that maybe this might be one of those cases where people are overreacting?
Absolutely not. We have to understand that racism is a global issue. Racism is something that was created in the way that we know it today to justify slavery back in the 1400s, and many of the ideas still manifest themselves in different parts of the world today. Again, the reason why organizations like Black Lives Matter and the movement were so large, because people in Europe can see we have similar issues here. People in South America, people in African countries, even places where black people are in the majority but may not have full power, full control, they see that this is something that we have to understand. We have more in common than we do that is separate. That is one of the reasons why Malcolm X was so popular back in the 60s, because he realized that the struggle for black rights was a human rights movement. And so this is definitely not a situation where we should be looking at this as an isolated incident. A man was gassed to death. I mean, when we have history of things in this world, like the Holocaust and so many other issues, and we're seeing someone being gassed in modern day, in the world today, all of us should take notice and be outraged by this.
I want to ask you a final question before we finish our show. We have about a minute and a half left. You mentioned there how in the favelas there still is tremendous crime. in those neighborhoods and also in some U.S. neighborhoods. So the question is, have all these protests really helped with that, which is a major issue for many of those poorer people dealing with tremendous crime? And these protests haven't really been able to address that issue, not the issue of police crime, police misconduct versus people, but people not having police to help them from criminals.
Well, it's been a mixed bag. I mean, take places like the United States, there have definitely been some communities where the protests have led to greater relations with the police. It's also led to greater relations in those cities with the governments as it relates to providing resources like summer jobs and other opportunities for economic empowerment for poor communities. And so there have been situations like that where there has been the case. But generally speaking, there are, on a larger scale, we need more areas to work with this issue of police reform and working to provide more opportunities in the community where crimes are occurring. Because the fact of the matter is, people don't just wake up saying, I want to do crime. People engage in crime because of lack of opportunities and resources. And in places like these favelas, and places like many inner cities in America, where you're cutting access to jobs, where you're cutting access to different programs, it can be a real challenge. So we have had some successes, but more needs to be done.
That's all we have time for, but thank you very much, Omékongo Dibinga, Professor of Intercultural Communication at American University, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.